Hi everyone, happy to see you in the App Excellence Summit. I'm Manuel Vivo, an Android Developer Relations Engineer at Google, and in this panel we are going to talk and learn about Android app architecture. As you may know, by the end of last year, the Android team published a revamped guide to app architecture, covering the data, domain, and UI layers in depth. I fully recommend going through the docs if you haven't done it already. Having a good architecture in place for your app allows it to scale, improve its quality and robustness, and make it easier to test. This has a direct impact on the Android developers of the team, who will be happier and more productive, and end users, who will enjoy a stable and high-quality application. But you don't have to take my word for it. With me, I have great Android engineers from Duolingo and Headspace that are going to share their experience on how they refactored their app architecture and how important it was for their company. Their case studies are published and the links can be found in the description. Greg, Leon, thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure for us. For those who don't know you, do you mind introducing yourself and tell us a bit about your company and your role?
Hey, thank you for having us. My name is Greg Rami. I'm a principal engineer at Headspace Health. At Headspace Health, we're a leading provider of mental health and well-being solutions. Through our flagship Headspace, Headspace for Work, and Ginger brands, we touch the lives of over 100 million people in 190 countries.
Hey, I'm Leon. I'm a senior software engineer over at Duolingo. I lead the Android stability and performance team. Duolingo is the world's most popular language learning platform and has made the daunting task of learning new languages feel easy and fun. Since 2012, we've taught over 500 million learners over 40 languages, all for free.
Wow, that's great. Thank you. Thank you both for being here. What you both have in common is that you revamped your architectures and adopted MVVM. We'll talk about the technical details later, but I'm interested in the motivation now. Revamping an app is not something that happens regularly in the lifecycle of a product. Can you tell us what led you to do this decision? Greg, you can start first if you want.
Yeah, so we went through a full rewrite actually of our application towards the end of 2019, so right before COVID. That was great timing. So we went into a pretty different direction in the business. So our backend was going to be different, the design was going to be different. And looking at our code, we had a lot of monolith classes, a lot of tight coupling in between our classes. It was really hard to refactor, add features. So we talked to our leadership and we made the case that even though we would have to take some time to get to a solid architecture and rewrite the app from scratch, on the long run, it would take way less time and it would be a way more exciting experience for our developers too, if we just rebuilt the whole app following the best new patterns, 100% Kotlin, MVVM, etc.
That's great. Leon?
So building an application as far-reaching as Duolingo requires us to be extra vigilant of any performance regressions on a broad set of devices and locales. Our learners really need to be able to focus on language content instead of being distracted by jittery animations and ANRs. To support this, we have a product quality area which continuously invests in performance monitoring and tooling. Back in 2020, it was this tooling that allowed us to see our rendering performance begin to regressing 5 to 10% per month. And we also really started hitting bottlenecks in our existing architecture, where we saw a small change in one feature have unexpected consequences on some other that were not touching any of the same code. So we quickly realized that we needed to prioritize structural changes to prevent such regressions, and also to better scale with our continuously growing number of engineers. So to kickstart this effort, we began 2021 with a 2-month cross-company effort to reboot our architecture.
That's great. Good stories, both of you. Going back to what Greg said about revamping the whole application, that's a daunting task, I would say. And so can you tell us a little bit how many Android engineers are in your team? And were you contributing to the old code base while working on the new application, or how did you organize yourself?
So because we had such a small team at the time, it was around 6 full-time Android employees. It was impossible to work on this rewrite and at the same time continue supporting the existing app. So what we decided was to only support the existing app if there would be severe bugs in production. And then the approach we took is that we thought about what are the core component of an architecture. And each of us took one of those and focused on that, created some quick prototypes, came up with some presentation to present what they found and talk about the pros and cons. So then as a team, we could decide that. And this whole process took about a week. And by the end of this week, we solidified our approach and what would be our new architecture. And we presented that to the rest of the company. And we try to estimate some timeline, but it's really hard when you rewrite an entire app. So we gave some rough estimate and we started breaking it down and going at it. And once we had the core architecture implemented, then we took each feature and we split it up. So each person would take one of the feature and re-implement it within the new architecture.
Ah, that's very good. And what about you, Leon? Like, you didn't rewrite the whole app from scratch, did you? How did you support all features, like all migrations? Like, how did you do it?
Yeah, so it's much harder to re-architect an app as it's going. So we also have a team of around 40 engineers working on the app. Another thing that makes this more complicated is our team is actually made up of a lot of folks for whom either Duolingo is their first job or they're coming from other platforms. So we have a need for a lot of training material and just making sure that everything scales really well. So for us, although the main portion of the reboot took, as I mentioned, about 2 months, we actually had a small team, kind of task force of sorts, start early and start documenting things and prototyping things and actually decide on an architecture, put forth a prototype that the folks could start playing around with and start learning. And only after that were we able to bring in the rest of the engineers into the process.
Okay, that's a really good approach. Love it. Sometimes convincing product managers and the leadership team to do these refactorings or migrations can be a little bit challenging and trying to sell that user value. So what were your biggest user benefit considerations when trying to improve the app quality? Greg, we can start with you.
Yeah, for us, it was pretty evident. We had a lot of crashes. The Android platform in particular, compared to like iOS and backend, was slower to work on features. We had a lot more complaints from users, a lot more ANRs. So I think it was pretty evident, not just to our team and the technology team, but to the rest of the company that there was something that needed to be improved. And on top of that, we were expanding even more and more to the international, in which the Android market is really dominant. So it made a lot of sense, and it didn't take too much convincing for our leadership team and product team to agree to that rewrite.
Sounds good. Leon?
Yeah. So because Duolingo is already so international, we have a lot of focus on our low to mid-end devices. So our key goals here from a user perspective was reducing user perceptible slowness and jink, making sure our animations are smooth or we are intentionally disabling them. And we're also fixing a lot of these perceptible bugs that break learners' experiences.
Sounds good. And how does the team approach refactorings? Do you enforce new features to follow the new patterns? For example, in your case in Duolingo, like rebuilding the app from scratch is not always possible. How do you enforce all of that?
So at Headspace Health, we have an Android backlog that we groom about every other week. And then we try to weigh the priorities of refactors, typically through a mix of what is the severity, whether it can unlock speed and productivity, and if it will soon become irrelevant through another refactor or upgrade or deprecation, which sometimes might be a little bit of looking into a crystal ball because we try and anticipate or see, what are all the, in which direction is the architecture trying to move into. But then as far as enforcing, we have several ways. We have a best practices document that's part of our onboarding process. So every developer goes through it and we try to keep it up to date. We also do code reviews. We write tech specs that we present during our what we call our chapter meeting. And we make sure we have presentations to make sure we have a consistent code base. And we don't really have old features now because we did a full rewrite. So everything is following our new architecture patterns. But as an example, when we moved to Hilt, we didn't get to fully finish that migration. So that's, for example, something that's in a halfway done, I would say. But we're working on that, and again, based on some of our priorities, we get to those refactors eventually.
Yeah, that's very good. Like I remember, like working at other companies before Google, like completing the refactoring was always a little bit hard because we were trying to try out the new things, mixing with other refactorings. So trying to finish what we started, it was complicated. But
yeah, there are always so many competing things.
Yeah, nice to have a process in place. What about you, Leon? Do you do something in Duolingo?
Yeah, I was going to add there, it's definitely also the case that we have a lot of migrations that are halfway. Hilt is a good example. It's really hard to Hiltify an entire application. And even though we started well over a year ago, we still have some components that are, either objects or are accessed more statically. But in general, when it comes to refactoring, we do like to work incrementally, and we make really heavy use of our experimentation framework. So if we can, we want to chunk things up and actually ship them and measure the impact. So in a lot of cases, the impact is negligible, which is actually good. It means your refactor is working and you're just picking a different way to do things. But in other cases, we have seen gains, especially when we introduce something like more reactive paradigms, or we're properly segmenting one stream out from another. In terms of following the new patterns, so we do the same type of thing that Greg mentioned in terms of teaching and presenting and having documentation. There's that architecture sample I mentioned that's really good for us. For enforcing, we like to make really heavy use of automation, actually. So while we do code reviews, we also have a lot of things like static linting and CI that will run both on machines and on our continuous integration servers. And then also we like to deprecate old patterns in code to make sure there's no new usages of them, and we can then use automation on top of that to make sure no new additions can be made.
That's very nice, like having the linting there just to prevent things from happening. It's actually a great idea. Yeah, when considering trying to do refactoring or migrating to something, having that interrupt story ready and in mind is always good, just to make sure that you don't break anything else. That's why it's sometimes important to have that proof of concept to see if what you are implementing is actually going to have a good effect in your application. Okay, let's move on to something like more technical. You opted for rewriting the app using MVVM. How did your teams validate MVVM initially and confirm that it was in fact an improvement over the previous architecture? Leon, do you want to start first this time?
Sure. So we did start with prototyping. We simultaneously started with MVVM and MVI to just try things out and see how they would go. MVP was an early consideration, but we quite quickly dismissed it because we knew we wanted a reactive architecture. From this point on, it was just a matter of prototyping and ensuring that things could be migrated. We saw that it was really easy to isolate the code here, which would allow us to then document which types of logic should go, which lends itself nicely to testing and where we plan to go.
Mm-hmm. Nice one. Greg?
So for us, we had an MVP pattern initially. We had a couple features already in MVVM. And I think the biggest benefit, one of the things we struggled a little bit with MVP is that we had to have our own logic and code to manually handle view lifecycle, or sometime for our presenter to be aware of those view lifecycles so they could take some action or dispose of some resources. And it was pretty cumbersome. So having view model and having that being part of the recommended guidelines from Google and being part of the actual framework, that made our life so much easier because we could focus on other things, right? We could focus on our core business as opposed to trying to handle those difficult tasks, because at the end of the day, view lifecycle is not that straightforward. And then also the MVVM pattern allowed us to have frictionless onboarding because now a lot of developers are familiar with it. They most of the time do that as well at their current company. It makes it easier to write unit tests. And at the end of the day, we had a lot of boilerplate code that went away because it was, again, part of the framework, and like Google keeps evolving it and improving it. So that made our life a lot easier.
Definitely agreed about the onboarding here. It was the case that even while we were coming up with our documentation, it was really helpful to just be able to point folks at Google's documentation. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, we are not trying to sell MVVM here. It just happened that you both implemented MVVM. But if you take a look at the revamped guide to app architecture we released like end of last year, we don't say MVVM per se, because there are other alternatives as way of handling things. Like definitely moving away from MVP, which is a model view presenter, where the view model has a reference to the view or to an interface, is definitely something we don't want to do, as you were saying, like because of scalability and so many other reasons. And what we call in our guides is UDF, unidirectional data flow, which is kind of, having like reactive streams, like everything is modeled as a stream, for example, state. And I was considering like there are other alternatives that people could use, because when we talk about MVVM, for example, there are so many preconceptions and there are different ways of thinking about the same pattern. And we didn't want to use that exact name because of that reason, because the preconceptions people could bring with them. So did you consider any other alternatives to MVVM? Greg, for example?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, we actually did. We looked at MVI, which was pretty popular back then too, I guess, because as you say, follow the same idea of unidirectional data flow. And we briefly looked at Viper because our iOS team was using that. But I think what made our decision was that our team is pretty small, so being able to leverage a component from the Android framework really made a difference for us. And then we saw all the benefit that I previously listed by using MVVM.
Yep. So similar case here, as I mentioned, we considered MVI, and here it's also the case that there isn't enough support in the Google core libraries for MVI, so we would have had to prototype and pick another off-the-shelf library that kind of worked. And there are tons of great alternatives here. It was just a matter of having to prototype with those and then commit to something long-term.
Nice, thank you. Yeah, definitely agree on that. Let's touch on different libraries that you implemented. Like, which libraries do you use in your app that help you achieve all of these benefits of app quality and all that? Can you briefly mention some of them? Greg, for example?
So we use a lot of the Jetpack libraries. When we pick a library, we try to use something that's widely used, really well documented. So typically the Jetpack libraries fit that. And what I find very interesting is that they sort of feed off each other. So a great example is if you use Hilt and view model, you can just use inject the view model into any views using Hilt. So that makes it very convenient. You can really leverage that. It's like, I always think about it's like if you have another army of developers who are working for you and improving this part of your code. So that's really something that we enjoy. And again, as a small team, it allows us to just focus on our core business and move forward there when we already have a lot of tasks to do. So those are the libraries we use and the benefits we see.
Nice. Liam?
Yep. So quite similarly, I think probably the largest one we had was from Hilt. Because we have such a big team, it made it a lot easier for us to make sure that our features were isolated. Before, there was quite a few objects and things floating around where you think code isn't dependent on something else, but it truly is, and we would break features completely elsewhere periodically. And then the second thing, of course, as you mentioned, unidirectional data flow. So our application has historically used ArgsJava, so we stuck to it instead of moving to something like coroutines. As far as continuing further, we are currently prototyping and starting to use Room, Preferences Data Store, and Jetpack testing.
Yeah, that sounds good. Like unidirectional data flow, it's one of my favorite patterns. Let's call it in that way. In Android, I remember those old days when we had to use event bus and all that. It was very difficult to trace back to where something was being called. I love unidirectional data flow for sure. Like something that came up a lot was about measuring and performance. So what were some of the key areas where the app performance was improved in the refactoring of the app? Greg?
So for us, the build time went down, which was great. The number of bugs and ANRs went down too, which again was amazing. Our app rating went way up from somewhere, I think, in the mid 3s to a high of like 4.8. So that was a pretty significant increase. Personally, my favorite was the app development velocity. That also went way up because, again, we had better architecture. People were much more familiar with the code. And one of my philosophy, the thing I feel very strongly about, is to spend a lot of time having a very strong base architecture. But then when I think about feature development, like just thinking about a screen, I feel like it's pretty similar from one screen to the other. So I like to build a very strong template, a blueprint, if you will. And then every new feature is pretty much a copy of that you tweak based on the, what is specific to this new screen. So if you have a very strong blueprint, a very strong pattern, it makes it that much easier to then create this new screen or create this new feature and just move quickly to, what's new, like what's different, what can you do a little better, as opposed to just, the day-to-day of implementing a feature.
Yeah, definitely. Liam?
Yeah, so for us, because a lot of our pre-reboot bottlenecks were the result of the central state that I mentioned, adding the repository and the view models in front really actually moved all of our metrics across the board as far as performance goes. And we've also found that developers are now stepping on each other's toes less. And we've had first a lot fewer regressions since the reboot, but even when they do occur, they're now much more isolated. So it's not anymore the case where we have the addition of some feature negatively impacting the performance of some other feature, which is really hard to even figure out.
Another thing I'll add is, which I'm sure a lot of developers are familiar with, is that we lost this fear of and this head scratching of when you touch something, you add a feature or you modify a feature, and something else breaks that seems totally unrelated. We got rid of that, which was amazing for developers.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, having happy developers is probably one of the best measures that you can have. What about the tools that you use to measure your app? Can you share a little bit more about it? Do you use macro benchmarking, or do you have like an in-house solution?
So our tools come in two flavors. So one is during development. So we like to use benchmarking through Android Studio or Perfetto. Plus, we also have some internal build flags and things that allow us to turn on even extra tracking on all of our streams to actually observe what's happening. This we find really helpful for fine-tuning features, especially on lower-end devices. And then when we actually get things out to users, that's when all of our metrics tools actually shine. So we are able to segment all of our data per screen, per user flow. That really allows us to understand where regressions happen, and we can classify them based on types of devices, whether we have animations disabled or enabled, what the performance mode of the device is. So it really allows us to adapt fluidly. Plus, we've also found more recently, Firebase Crashlytics has added a lot more ways to filter issues, which has been really helpful, and as well as the ANR tracking added through there.
It's very nice. I think we've talking a little bit about technical details, and probably let's move on to something more like high level. What about the result of the refactoring for the end users? Can you tell us about the results and how has increased the Android quality has benefited your users? Greg?
So the improvements to the app in terms of business, it led already to a 20% increase in paid subscriber between operating system, so which was pretty good. We also leveraged some, so in combination of the improving the architecture and the app overall, we also leveraged the app review library from Google. So that's what drove, as I mentioned earlier, our app reviews from like the mid 3s to the upper 4s in the span of like 2 quarters, which was huge. Yeah. And it helped a lot too with our ranking in the Google Play Store. So that had a big impact. And which also led to a 15% increase in monthly active users because we had that increased rating. But internally, it also allowed us to create faster and be more confident in our workflows when we develop new features. So as you mentioned earlier, happier developers. We spend a little less time on testing because we feel more confident about it. We have a lot of gating and testing before we release features. Now we have more than 80% coverage of our code. So it gives us more time to implement new features, improve the architecture. So those are, I think, the key result is that we feel so much better about working within the code base.
Yeah. Leo, what about you?
Yeah, so for us, the gains are a lot more metrics-based in terms of performance. So we dropped our ANR rate by 41%, which was huge.
Wow.
Our slow frames, which we consider a key metric, so this is essentially when a frame doesn't render fast enough at 60 frames per second, Android winds up letting it go long, which winds up dropping other frames. So this is a key metric for all of our screens, and that we reduced by 28%. And then scrolling in a lot of our scrollable screens is 40% faster. So now with this, the stable architecture and kind of conventions we've established around things like animations, our team is now really focusing on adding more delightful moments and engaging our users instead of spending all of this time trying to fight jank in all of these screens.
Yeah, as I was saying at the beginning, like investing in architecture really pays off, like both in terms of happy developers, which are more productive and enjoy more like the day-to-day job, but also end users. Like you can see, like for example, with Headspace, like the app reviews like went up massively, and that's amazing. And also having like a great experience with no crashes and everything, like that's something that it's more enjoyable to everyone, to be honest. Okay. We are coming to an end now, and I would like you to give an advice to our listeners. So what advice would you give developers looking to unlock growth opportunities by increasing Android quality? Greg?
So I think I would go right off what you just mentioned, which is To me, having a consistent app architecture and having a very strong foundation, again, relying on some tried and true libraries that you leverage, and then having a single pattern across features that you feel very strong about. Because as you mentioned, you're going to add new developers, and a lot of developers, when you're new to a code base, you try going through a couple features and your task is to implement a new feature. So you're going to copy what someone else did in another feature. Now, if everyone has their own way of doing something, you're going to end up with something that's very different across the board. And then when you try to refactor that or to improve it or to migrate to a different library, it will take so much more time because no one is agreeing on what is the existing architecture, let alone what are we moving towards to. So I think it's having those difficult conversations and agreeing on a pattern, and then really seeing the value in enforcing that through some automated way, which I think is always better when possible, or through reviews, discussions, to make sure you have that consistent framework.
Leon?
Yeah, so two pieces of advice, and I think they're a little bit more high level. So the first is to get your developers an average device. So at the beginning of the reboot, we actually had our engineers buy and expense the world's most popular $200 phone. This has actually resulted in engineers noticing the bottlenecks of the features they write, and we've kind of reaped the rewards of this since. We don't have a lot of these regressions even see the light of day, because as an engineer is building something, they will see that it's not performing well. And if you can optimize it on a low-end device, it's certainly going to fly on a high-end one. And the second one, of course, is what I keep going back to, is measure everything. So not just your crash and ANR rates, also key flows like app startup, how long it takes to start, what's most important for your application. So for us, for instance, it's starting a lesson on Duolingo. You want to ideally segment all of this data by screen, and you will actually be amazed by what your data can tell you about where those optimization opportunities are.
Yeah. I love it. And also my 2 cents here would be also investing. We've been talking a lot about this as well. Investing in testing, like having that confidence when you are migrating or changing something in your app, making sure that you haven't broken anything, it's priceless. That's really important as well. I think it's being me asking a lot of questions. I would like you to have the opportunity to ask us to either the other company or myself. So Greg, do you want to ask us anything? You have something in mind you want to discuss?
Yeah, so there's something we're always thinking about and, grappling with is thinking about prioritizing those refactors and upgrades or migration when there are so many you could do, right? There are so many library upgrades, dependencies. There are so many new technologies coming up and even recommendations. So how do you think about those and how do you pick the next one to tackle?
Leon, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so I think the general philosophy is the fewer the better, right? You want to have that key set of libraries that you depend on and not continuously grow it because it just fragments how you build things. Plus, it adds extra weight to your app, so the download size is larger, which can impact international markets. As far as prioritizing things goes, to some extent, it's staying up to date with your existing libraries, and we tend to phase things as well. So that way we can see if we bumped a couple of libraries and there's a big regression in the following app, we can try to attribute some of that.
Yeah, I would say, like, for me, I guess, as always, it depends. But you need to, as Leon was saying before about how many libraries do you depend on, you have to find a good balance between not reinventing the wheel and getting something useful for your application. In terms of upgrading to the latest version, different teams have different rules, of course. But you have to also keep a good balance between not lagging a lot behind, because otherwise when you need a feature that is available in one of the latest libraries, then you are going to suffer a lot from migrating 2 or 3 versions at the same time. If they have breaking changes, it might be even worse. Like, for example, thinking of the latest version of Fragments where they rewrote the internals, it might require a little bit more of testing, making sure both automated and manual testing. So I would say, like, I would keep an eye on how many improvements and features are new to the libraries and trying to say, okay, how much effort is gonna take me to upgrade? And so trying to negotiate that with PMs and all that and the rest of the team might be a good way of doing it. Do you have anything in mind, Greg, that you want to share about this topic?
No, yeah, a lot of what you mentioned, we, it's all about balance. So we have a small team, so we love leveraging libraries, but at the same time, then you create some potential issue within your code, right? And as Leon mentioned, we also try to keep in mind the weight of the app. So yeah, it's finding the right balance there, and then having those discussions with product, of trying to get them to see the value in doing some of those updates or migration or refactors.
Yeah, and a good way to show that value is by measuring the improvement of what you do. Leon, do you have any questions you want to ask us?
Yeah, I wanted to know how you guys think about other form factors. So tablets are something that has kind of come and gone, and now it feels like it's making a comeback. And then what's also happening with things like foldables, which are pretty new to the ecosystem.
Greg, you want to start answering?
Yeah, so we don't, at Headspace Health personally, have a lot of developer invested into having our app on those form factors. Like, it's available there. But what I think is it's interesting when you can not just repeat the same experience on those different form factors, but add something. So for us, for example, we're looking at tablets and TVs, which are like way larger screen because we have what we call our move content. So it's, physical activities, you can do yoga, you can do different things like that. And I feel like it lends itself perfectly. So I think it's important not to force the form factor just because it's something that people use or because it becomes trendy, but really because it adds a lot of value to our application. Because at the end of the day, it does take time for developers. Sometimes it'll take time to integrate that within your CI/CD pipeline. So I think you really have to weigh, like, is it valuable to add that? But I think if it's an added touch point for user, like wearable, we're also thinking about cars. How do we get people to interact with Headspace to maybe feel, a little bit more relaxed or focus in their vehicle. So that's the thing that we're looking at. But again, I think it has to be worth the effort. It has to add something to the core experience.
I agree. And from the Android side of things, we are actively improving the experience and trying to let developers develop to, for tablets or foldables, wearables as easy as possible, just to make it easier for you to do the same things. And we are actually investing, for example, a lot of time in documentation, best practices in the architecture side of things. That's why, for me, it's important as well. Like, for example, when we talk about view models to be generic enough so that it can accommodate, a phone, a tablet, a foldable, because now it's everything together, right? Like, you can have a foldable, which is a mix between a tablet or a big phone. So that's enough if you have the foundations of your app ready and you, for example, keep it generic enough and say, okay, I want to show this to the user. Not, for example, mandating I want to navigate to the screen, because navigating could have a use case for a phone, but if you're in a tablet, you may not want to navigate. So having that flexibility in place, it's quite important. And that's something we are investing as well. As I was saying, in best practices now, with foldables, we adapted JetNews, one of our compose samples, to foldables. And in there, you can see how, it's generic. We are trying to restore state and keep state as much as possible. So those best practices are quite important when developing for any kind of form factor. Unfortunately, this is all the time we have today. I hope people have seen how Headspace and Duolingo's commitment to Android app excellence led them to business success. I want to thank Greg and Leon for participating in this panel. It was a lot of fun for me and I had a great time. If you want to know more about their case studies, check out the website g.co/android/app excellence. And if you want to learn more about app architecture, don't forget to visit our guide to app architecture documentation. Links in the description. Thank you for watching. Bye.